Hello. This is going to be an exhaustive response to a video by Whatifalthist. Whatifalthist's video is called Explaining America's Identity in 10 Ethnicities, and in it he talks about American history. While the video is supposed to explain America's identity, instead it gives an outdated, culturally deterministic view of American history, which is dependent on lies, false narratives, and bad sources. Despite the large number of catastrophic errors in this video, the video has received 1.2 million views and has attracted very little criticism. It's my worry that people who just want to learn about history might believe the falsehoods in the video, so I've decided to make this video response. I'm going to go through the sections of the video and correct the record. As you might guess from looking at the timecode of this video, there are a lot of mistakes. However, on many of these topics I'm going to go into detail, because I think a lot of the information is quite interesting. So, let's get started.
Number 1, the Native Americans. Modern America treats the Native Americans like they'd like them to have been, rather than who they really were. And for both the right and the left, that is basically the image of them being uncivilized hippies. The less philosophic view of the world is underwrit by the need to have a noble savage, and the right by the need to demonstrate the superiority of Western civilization. At the same time, societies in the eastern United States were the place in the world where women had the most rights and power. However, the flip side to this is that the natives weren't angels. Warfare was endemic, with it often being normal that 20% of young men would die in war, far above rates in Europe.
Whatifalthist uses these world and data charts of ethnographic and archaeological data, which, as the author of the article notes, are mostly taken from a 2011 book by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. The claim that 20% of men would have died in war also comes from the book. Whatifalthist then clumsily connects this to Native American conflict. The purpose of Pinker's book is to argue that violence has declined progressively through human history, but in recent years, the better angels of our nature has largely been discredited, and Pinker's statistics have been shown to be extremely suspect. One interesting thing is that the World in Data author has removed all of Pinker's hunter-gatherer statistics because of a critique by Douglas Fry. But he doesn't correct the archaeological sources that are shown to be wrong by Brian Ferguson in the same book. If we want to understand human prehistory, then mobile hunter-gatherer bands are our best look, as that is how we have lived for 99% of our existence. However, the author was right to remove Pinker's hunter-gatherer statistics, considering it's a cherry-picked sample, which is a mix of rare cases who do engage in warfare, and in some cases only recording instances of hunter-gatherers being murdered by encroaching settlers. Douglas Fry finds in a more accurate sample of modern hunter-gatherer groups, most don't engage in warfare at all, and many have extremely low levels of interpersonal violence. Now, what about this non-state societies list? Well, these aren't representative of prehistory either. The Yanomami, Jivaro, and Waorani are what are called shattered tribes from the Amazon Shatter Zone. When European powers invaded South America, this caused catastrophic population collapses due to disease, invasion, and slave raiding by the Spanish and Portuguese. While other groups were destroyed, these tribes fled to the hinterlands, dramatically changing their way of life and surviving by adopting an aggressive defense. Of the Waorani, Rybarczyk and Rybarczyk say, quote, "Given the socio-cultural environment of the region, and with no safe refuge available, engaging in at least defensive warfare would have been a functional prerequisite for the survival of any group." End quote. The data for the Waorani comes from between 1900 and 1960, which was a period of extreme violence. The Waorani were at war with rubber barons and oil companies, who invaded their territory and hired mercenaries to kill them, enslaving many of them to work on their plantations. This then intensified infighting amongst the Waorani as intergroup solidarity collapsed. The Waorani have mostly been at peace with each other and outsiders since the 1970s. With the Jivaro and the Yanomami too, the data is taken from the most violent periods, but it's come to be understood that conflict amongst the Yanomami was largely caused by major outside factors. Brian Ferguson says, quote, "Not every single case of war, but the great majority of cases occur shortly after a major change in the Western presence and involve those who have better access to Western goods, fighting those who were more removed from Western sources." End quote. With the Yanomami, Wairani, and Jivaro, the influence of the trade in steel tools was a decisive factor in conflict, as they were very useful to their horticultural way of life, but these goods were distributed unevenly, causing significant tensions between the haves and the have-nots. The Yanomami to this day are faced with attempted genocide and invasions by illegal miners and loggers. The tribes of New Guinea on the list have also been significantly negatively impacted by states, whether through direct violence or modern trade networks.
These cases represent what is called the tribal zone effect, where warfare is intensified by the presence and actions of a state. So I hope you can see that these conditions are not anything like prehistoric warfare. As for the archaeology, it turns out that this list of archaeological sites is perhaps the most cherry-picked yet. 3 of the cases are actually duplicates, because Pinker copied them from 2 separate lists. Others have exaggerated numbers. Crow Creek and Jebel Sahaba in Nubia were the sites of conflict triggered by extreme ecological crisis, and surveys that include tens of thousands of samples from an entire region over hundreds of years are given equal weight in these charts to ones that have 8 samples. Pinker's list shows a small fraction of the available archaeological data, so what does the whole archaeological record show? Well, for example, a review of ancient human remains over 10,000 years old, including 2,900 skeletons, found only 4 skeletons bearing signs of violence. Other archaeological surveys looking at all the evidence, specifically focusing on signs of warfare from Europe, the Middle East, and North America, clearly show war entirely absent, and then developing in different parts of the world at different times as the conditions for war were met. The main ones being political complexity, sedentary living, hierarchical social structures, and resource hoarding. Generally speaking, in most cases, cooperation between groups and migration to other areas would have been far better survival strategies than conflict, which helps explain why humans migrated to every continent in the world by the time agriculture developed. Some academics still speculate that the prehistoric past was more violent than the evidence suggests, but they no longer claim anything like 20% of men would have died in war. I'll link the supplementary information from a Gomez et al. Paper, which shows a catalogue of archaeological data, much broader than Pinker's, and I'll also link an article by Thibaut Routard, summarizing where the current debate over violence in prehistory stands.
It is true that warfare was endemic to North America by the time of European contact. Most Native American societies were chiefdoms of thousands of people who combined agriculture with hunting, and generally had some form of social hierarchy. But there is very good reason to believe, contrary to what Whatifalthist says, Indian warfare was far less brutal and lethal than in Europe, where warfare was also endemic. Quoting archaeologists David Dye and Franklin Keel, quote, "In contradiction to European warfare, Native American intersocietal conflict emphasized bravery and war honors rather than conquest and mass body counts. In general, based on archaeological and ethnohistoric documentation, only a few warriors would be killed in battle, and the majority of prisoners would be adopted or enslaved. Overall, indigenous warfare did not embrace wholesale slaughter." End quote. On the other hand, European warfare at the time was based on siege and scorched earth, which caused huge civilian casualties. Indians tended to obey different rules of war to Europeans. Many Indians practiced ritual cannibalism and torture, which horrified Europeans, and Indians targeted sentries and officers in combat, which Europeans considered uncivilized. At the same time, the brutality of European warfare, the mass slaughter of the vanquished, and the violence against women and children in turn horrified Indians. Europeans saw American Indians as savage, not because they were more violent than Europeans, but because different forms of violence were normalized in each society. Dye and Keel go on. In dealing with lawless subjects, European military tradition was clear. Whatever force was necessary to compel absolute submission was justified. including the utter destruction of the foe. Entire populations were legitimate military targets. Examples of this are with the Pequot War in 1637 and in the Jamestown Wars in 1609.
Also, just look at the Iroquois tribe who committed literal genocide against the whole Midwest from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, killing all the local peoples in order to sell their beaver pelts to the Europeans.
Unwittingly, Whatifalthist is bringing up a textbook example of how European colonialism undermined and ultimately destroyed Native American societies. The Iroquois normally occupied a small territory and clashed only occasionally with their Algonquin neighbors, but the introduction of European trade changed all that. European trade was toxic in the sense that both the goods they received and those they sold were damaging to their societies, all the while fueling conflict. The Iroquois rapidly expanded their hunting grounds to acquire furs to sell to the Europeans in order to acquire guns. Native societies were entrapped by a race to the bottom out of fear of imminent destruction, that their local rivals or European powers would be able to conquer them by having superior weaponry. Other Indian tribes and chiefdoms resorted to slave raiding and trading in order to acquire European guns. Indian societies that embraced slaving grew in power, and many that did not were soon destroyed. Perhaps a quarter of the Indian population of the American South was enslaved between 1685 and 1715. This paralleled the behavior of many West African societies in response to the Atlantic slave trade, where millions were enslaved.
Something a lot of people fail to understand is that the elites, whether the British or on the East Coast, often had a lot of sympathy with the natives, but there was very little centralized power in the frontier.
This isn't correct. Whilst there were some elites, like Roger Williams and William Penn, who had great sympathy for the Indians, by and large, the elites carried out a policy of mass slaughter, divide and rule, and enslavement. This continued well into the colonial era. For example, colonial governments frequently paid bounties for the scalps of Indian men and women. As to this blurb about the Proclamation Line of 1763, why would the British stop expanding at that point? This was not done out of sympathy for the Indians. This was an attempt to prevent the colonists starting another expensive war. After all, it was because the British were still paying off the huge war debts of the French and Indian War that the British taxed the colonies, which started the chain of events leading to the American Revolution.
Native cultures gained a massive resurgence over the 20th and 21st centuries, and I think a great irony is that the number of people who identify as Native American has gone through the roof, mostly due to white people with infinitesimally small amounts of native blood identifying as Native. However, the number of genetically Native people is collapsing, as Native Americans are the lowest birth rate of any group in America, far below replacement rate, so much so that there might not even be natives at the end of the century.
This is a misunderstanding of Indian identity, which is a combination of having heard of a few famous cases of pretendians with not understanding how tribal membership works. While Indian tribes have blood quantums for membership, which they only adopted within the past 100 years, fundamentally you either are or are not a member of a tribe. There is no middle ground. Indian identity is rooted in the institutions and traditions of each tribe, not in genetics.
There's a sort of sad poetry to the native peoples. They went from controlling a whole continent to being strangers in their own nation, not even 2% of the population, in all less than a century.
It's interesting how Whatifalthist started off by condemning the myth of the noble savage. Then he says there's a sad poetry to Native Americans, all whilst engaging in the myth of all the real Indians died off. All in all, I count 5 of the myths identified by Dunbar Ortiz and Hillia Whittaker in Whatifalthist's section on Native Americans.
Number 2, English Americans. On the U.S. Census Survey, English Americans are around 7% of the population, but analyses of anything objective, whether genetics compiling data from older censuses or last name analyses, show that Americans of English descent are by far the largest ethnic group in America. Americans tend to view their ancestry through who their last ancestor they remember coming over was. In our days of diversity, people tend to only pay attention to things that are spicy and different from the baseline.
Here is a major issue with this video. Whatifalthist constantly switches between talking about culture, ancestry, and self-identity in what he means by ethnicity. To elaborate on what I mean, when talking about modern America, neither ancestry nor self-identity are reliable determinants of culture among many or even most Americans. Considering things like apple pies and Shakespeare plays are a part of general American culture, what makes a self-described English American more culturally English than the average American? What makes a German American culturally German? It isn't drinking beer or eating hamburgers. And it has to be said, there's no point in complaining about people not identifying with a particular ethnicity, especially after hundreds of years of cultural change and intermarriage, especially if what these labels mean is completely unclear. Whatifalthist seems to want to talk about culture, but he ends up stuck on ancestry and self-identity. It's worth mentioning that no genetic analysis of Americans that I'm aware of has separated out English from British or Irish ancestry, and that the most common English surnames are extremely common among Black Americans.
Practically every major institution of America dates back to an English precedent, whether government, personal freedoms, economic system, religion, military structure, and the list goes on. I mean, culture is incredibly important for how societies develop, and it's not a coincidence that nations with similar cultures like the Anglosphere, but very different geographies, end up with similar economic conditions. And so the English created the fundamental core of American society.
What he's describing here are political and economic institutions, not culture. Our institutions are largely the consequences of power struggles between different classes and interest groups, not our culture. Culture is our customs, our traditions, food, language, etc. For example, democratic institutions exist across wildly differing cultures.
Three major groups of English Americans came over during the colonial era, creating the cultural framework that became America. The first were Puritans who came from Eastern England to New England. They were effectively a religious cult that demanded extremely strict rules and standards of conduct out of their followers. The flip side to this was that their society was extremely wealthy, creative, and functional. The second group of Englishmen were Cavaliers from the south of England, or the second sons of nobility, and their peasants who created the culture of the American South. This was a more rowdy and fun, but also less creative and fair society than New England. And the third group were Quakers from the north of England, who came to Pennsylvania and established an anarcho-capitalist state that became the basis for the stereotypically middle American culture of being hardworking, friendly, not trusting government, and minding your own goddamn business.
Whatifalthist's description of colonial-era English immigration is based on a 1989 book called Albion Seed by David Hackett Fischer. Albion Seed contains a lot of interesting information and fun stories. Its thesis is that America has four main regional identities, and that each is descended from a regional identity of the British Isles. Fischer's arguments are mainly dependent on anecdotes which he uses to paint extreme caricatures of each identity based on stereotypes to back up the book's main assumptions. According to Albion Seed, the Puritans came from East Anglia to New England and were industrious but too judgmental. The Quakers who came from the Midlands to the Delaware region were tolerant and kind, but detached from reality. The Cavaliers who came from the south of England to the American South were honourable, but hierarchical and racist, and the borderers who went from the northern border regions to Appalachia were freedom-loving, but violent, ignorant, and xenophobic. But according to Fischer, the four groups have balanced each other out, and through common cause, have negated their flaws but kept their virtues to make America exceptional. When you think about it, it's actually quite a silly book, sabotaged by its faulty premise, and academic reviewers agree. Boiling down America's first British immigrants into regional clusters is an uphill battle. It simply didn't work like that. The best Fischer can do for the Puritans is to say that 40% of the original English settlers of Massachusetts were from East Anglia, and most 17th century New England settlers came from the eastern counties of England all added together. The eastern counties of England don't constitute a distinct cultural region, and they compose such a huge and heavily populated area as to make this observation useless. Furthermore, it is far easier to understand the Puritans as a religious or even as an economic group, rather than a regional one. And although Fischer talks extensively about Puritan religious culture, the near-total collapse of the Puritan religion after 1776 appears to be of no relevance to him, even though you would assume there's been a major cultural shift there. Fischer claims the Quaker migration to Pennsylvania was predominantly from the English Midlands, and Whatifalthist makes the mistake of believing him. But his own data shows they came more from the north and south of England. He says they came from the Midlands essentially because that's what's left, geographically speaking. Both Fischer and Whatifalthist bizarrely attribute a consistent political identity to Quakers that inspired Middle American identity. In reality, the first Quaker leaders were liberals, but by the time of the American Revolution, they were conservatives. Afterwards, they completely fell from power. Today, Quakers are associated with social justice. And there are geographical troubles with the Cavalier group too. Albion Seed's Cavaliers come from a region that covers half of England. And the idea of elite Cavaliers being a consistent identity in America over time is based entirely on myth. While many of the early elite of Virginia were upper-class royalists, there was great economic mobility from the middle class to the upper class in the colonial American South before the American Revolution. And there was great cultural change too. The first proprietors of Virginia had originally conceived the colony as an intensely hierarchical society based on the exploitation of the natives, but after this failed, they made political concessions to attract European settlers. The social hierarchy of the South was a new invention after the 1670s, emphasizing race over social class. Subsequently, the elite planters of the South embraced many Enlightenment ideas which rejected many traditional hierarchies like the monarchy, nobility, and church, and along with the huge debts they owed to British merchants, led them to support the American Revolution. The Cavalier myth came in the 1800s as cotton-rich elite Southerners sought to explain their differences with Northerners over slavery. Leading Southern thinkers proposed Northerners oppose slavery because they were themselves a servile race, descended from Saxon peasants, whereas the Southerners were descended from Norman nobility. As the Genoveses point out, they probably knew this wasn't true, and James McPherson observes, many of the aspects of Southern elite culture were recent contrivances they had simply copied and pasted from Walter Scott novels. And in this fact, we can find another problem with Whatifalthist wanting to act as if English Americans have remained a self-conscious ethnic group through history. White Northerners and Southerners began to be seen as two different peoples, which some argued were caused by separate origins or different climate, although we know these differences were caused by institutions, particularly slavery.
12% of Americans are of Mayflower descent.
3%. Not 12.
An important final note is that WASPs, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, have a reputation for being wealthy in the status quo, but that's really not the case anymore. Your average English American is poorer than your average white American, and WASPs are actually underrepresented in elite positions, probably due to their overrepresentation in rural areas.
So, Whatifalthist misunderstands what WASP means. It either refers to all Americans of British Protestant descent, not just English, or, usually, a much smaller group of the traditional elite of the United States, who tend to come from certain religious denominations originating in the British Isles, like Episcopalians and Presbyterians. These religious denominations do continue to be overrepresented in business and politics, although they've massively declined in size and influence since the 1970s, and particularly since the 1930s, when they were dominant.
Number 3, African Americans. America was peripheral to the Atlantic slave trades, and it didn't make sugar, which was the big moneymaker of the time. Thus, America got a lot of those stubborn and free-thinking slaves from the Igbo and Yoruba peoples of modern Nigeria, who populated the northern South, while meanwhile the southern South was largely people from the Congo and Angola.
Firstly, I'd like to say the description of these people as stubborn is weird. We might ask, what behavior is he characterizing as stubborn? Well, this comment is actually based on old slavery-era race management myths, which Roediger and Esch point out were stereotypes invented by plantation owners in order to appear more knowledgeable and to reinforce the idea that slavery and the assignment of roles according to race and nationality had a natural basis. There never was any basis to these stereotypes. Planters from other parts of the Americas believed entirely different stereotypes. Also, these maps and statements about people from different regions going to different parts of the South is complete nonsense, according to actual genetic records.
However, since America had such a high standard of living in general, American slaves had better standards of living and quality of life than slaves in other areas of the Americas, and even than many peasantries in European countries like Ireland or Ukraine.
This is, I think, a very, very pernicious thing to say. This claim of high standards and quality of life is based on reports that enslaved people ate high-calorie diets. However, if we look at what the experts say, in a book called The Changing Body, Health, Nutrition, and Human Development in the Western World since 1700, a group of experts, including Robert Fogel, from whom the claim of high-calorie diets originally comes from, say that enslaved people had to consume about 4,200 calories per day. Had to. Because they worked long hours and the intensity of labor per hour was so high. A high-caloric diet was needed to sustain such levels of high activity. So you see, enslavers fed adults high-calorie diets in order to maximize the labor they could extract from them. But here's another harrowing fact about how slavery operated, and I quote from Richard Steckel. One example is the extraordinary depressed growth in American slave children and their substantial recovery as teenagers. The children were among the smallest ever measured, but enslaved adults were not particularly short. To continue, the extent of deprivation and catch-up was extraordinary and unprecedented in historical or modern populations. Steckel goes on to explain that enslaved people were denied proper nutrition until they reached the age of 10, the age at which they would start doing field labor. Steckel tells us non-working slaves were fed little meat, but owners discovered their workers could not perform hard labor without meat in their diet, which implies that parents potentially paid a heavy price for sluggish field work, possibly whipping, if they shared much of the meat rations with their children. End quote. Steckel concludes, remarkably, this pattern of deprivation and catch-up was potentially profitable for slave owners. So you see, enslavers neglected the nutritional needs of the children they enslaved, because in terms of physical growth, they could catch up during their teenage years. But not only did this severely inhibit their general development, enslaved children had extremely high mortality rates as a result of this neglect. Now, with the proper context, does high-calorie intake seem to represent high standards of living and quality of life?
They were removed from their families, prevented from gaining any tradable skills or education. If there's any historic equivalent to being raised by an abusive, alcoholic, narcissistic parent, it's this.
No. Slavery is nothing like having an abusive or narcissistic parent.
Legal discrimination was brought to an end by the remarkable and admirable movement by Martin Luther King to gain legal equality.
Martin Luther King's campaigning wasn't just to gain legal equality, something that people like Whatifalthist like to whitewash. Dr. King's statements make that clear. And in speeches he repeatedly compared what economic advantages white Americans had received in comparison to black Americans at the time of emancipation. He pointed out that white Americans had received millions of acres of land for free, had received subsidized higher education, low interest rates, and subsidies not to farm. And
they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with. And this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
At the same time, the income gap between black and white people has grown, and a huge percentage of the black community lives in degrading poverty. We know this income gap largely isn't caused by discrimination, given that Nigerian Americans have higher incomes than white Americans.
Firstly, we do know discrimination is a major factor. Meta-analysis of studies show that white Americans receive 36% more job application callbacks than African Americans, 72% more job offers, and 57% of black Americans report discrepancies in earning equal pay or promotions. Other studies have shown that employers prefer white candidates who have a criminal record to black candidates with no criminal record. Secondly, Nigerian immigrants may be stereotyped differently to other black Americans. But most importantly, Nigerian immigrants are a hyper-selected immigrant group, coming from the richest and most highly educated Nigerians. 62% of Nigerian immigrants have bachelor's degrees. 29% have postgraduate degrees. But here's the thing. Despite being far more highly qualified than the average American, Nigerian immigrants are only slightly wealthier on average. And this was supposed to prove racial discrimination doesn't exist? In any case, claiming that the experiences of elite immigrants disproves the existence of racial discrimination is so callous and ignorant.
Studies found that there's no IQ or educational gap between black and white children of American military members raised abroad, but cultural and social factors in America create said differences. I'm going to get my controversial opinion out now, but I don't think the current emphasis and direction that the black community gets preached at by social justice is healthy. Imagine, just as an example, if you were a psychologist or friends with the metaphorical black community, which was coming out of centuries of oppression and trauma. You would never tell it to build its entire identity around victimhood and say that there's nothing it can do and try to get concessions from the rest of society. You would try to find a way to come to terms with the awful things that had happened and do what was right going forward.
Here we see a cultural determinism that is totally ignorant of history. In diagnosing the problems of the black community as a psychological problem, Whatifalthist completely ignores the principal factors that have caused the present social and economic inequalities between black and white Americans. Beyond slavery and segregation, Whatifalthist does not mention these factors. Either through ignorance or malice, Whatifalthist paints a picture that the real disadvantages that have affected black Americans are all in the deep past. I will go over a few of the actual major factors. I'll start off with education. The education gap is a major issue that fuels the wealth gap between black and white Americans. A college graduate will make on average $1.8 million more over their lifetime than a high school graduate. Black college graduates do earn less than white college graduates, probably linked to the issues of employment discrimination I discussed before, but college provides a major route out of poverty. The percentage of black Americans with college degrees has risen greatly since 1960. But poor quality schooling and the high costs of a college education serve to limit the number who can attend and finish college. Poor quality of education and historic injustice go hand in hand. Because 45% of school funding comes from local taxes, there is and has long been a large gap between what majority non-white schools receive per pupil compared with majority white schools. As a result, non-white schools tend to underperform. And the reason why there are black schools and white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods in the United States is predominantly historical. Poverty limits social mobility. It's been proven that poverty has a negative effect on childhood education, basically from the beginning. In addition to this, poor children often get put on different education tracks that steer them away from academic topics. The Martin Luther King quote I read earlier mentioned a few of the reasons why black Americans never got a good start after the end of slavery, as opposed to white Americans and European immigrants. But inequality between black and white increased during the 20th century in a way that still affects our present circumstances. From the 1930s, the US government offered low-interest home loans, but black communities were deemed financially risky, redlined, and federal guidelines explicitly denied funding to integrated housing. These are the policies that created the modern suburbs and the underserved urban areas. Most significant of all was the GI Bill, which is considered to be one of the most transformative economic policies in US history. At the end of World War II, the US government offered free college education or training to millions of veterans, 8 million of whom took up the offer, doubling the number of college graduates in the US by 1950. The bill also granted 4.3 million home loans by 1955. This bill, and the National Housing Act, created the modern American middle class, bringing prosperity to millions of poor Americans, wiping out differences in wealth and status between recent immigrant groups and other Americans. Unfortunately, it was, as Ira Katznelson points out, affirmative action for white people. While more than 1 million black Americans served in World War II, few saw any of the major benefits of the GI Bill. The price of passing the bill, the most comprehensive and formally democratic policy in American history, was giving the control of funding to each state, and the southern states, where black veterans overwhelmingly came from, practiced explicit racism, and northern universities only offered a token number of places to black students at the time. While many may complain about modern affirmative action, there has never been any comparable policies for black Americans to these policies. These are hardly all the racially discriminatory policies that were implemented during the 20th century, but they were the most consequential undertaken by the federal government. Some of the starkest gaps between black and white Americans today are in household wealth, which is based largely on home ownership, and is also reflected in the housing segregation between black and white communities. To this day, black Americans are disproportionately denied loans from banks, even when controlling for all other factors besides race. And in fact, the 2008 financial crisis was caused in part by banks' racist practices against black Americans. While northern factories before World War II largely either refused to hire black workers or only employed them in menial or dangerous roles, after the Civil Rights Act, opportunities did greatly expand for black Americans in the industrial economy. However, a shift in the economy since the 1970s to the new technology sector, creating jobs requiring a college education, served to harm the prospects of black Americans, because while the number of black graduates was increasing, it was still a small minority. In the 1980s, the introduction of Reaganomics tilted the American economy in favor of the wealthy, which hurt most black Americans. In fact, a noticeable trend in America is that when Republicans are in power, black Americans frequently do poorly, which makes the claim of discrimination not playing a major role particularly bizarre. If one of the two major parties in the country is actively hostile to black economic interests, and appears not to care that it has very little appeal to black voters, how is it possible to claim that discrimination is not a major part of American society? In fact, Republican politicians and voters tend to see advances for the black community as requiring white Americans to lose out.
You would never tell it to build its entire identity around victimhood and say that there's nothing it can do and try to get concessions from the rest of society. You would try to find a way to come to terms with the awful things that had happened and do what was right going forward.
One thing I'll say about this is that black and white Americans tend to agree on the problems that face black America. Where they differ is that white Americans are far less keen to do anything about these problems.
Before the 1960s, black Americans had higher marriage and lower drug usage rates than the white community, and significantly lower crime rates than afterwards, as well as being a community that, when polled, had massive interest in education. However, some shift that I don't fully understand occurred in the 1960s that resulted in an epidemic of crime, family breakdowns, lower educational interest, and drug usage in the black community. For some perspective, black people commit 5 times the per capita murder rate of white people, while there's a 26-point gap in educational achievement.
So, Whatifalthist is wrong about crime, and to attribute crime to being a cultural problem. Meta-analysis of predictors of crime have shown that the best explanation for high crime rates is what is called concentrated disadvantage. Crime concentrates in specific neighborhoods that have high poverty, unemployment, weak social institutions, poor quality housing, segregation, weak access to public services, or are otherwise marginalized. The United States continues to practice mass incarceration, in spite of the fact that crime has continued falling, and incarceration has been proven not only to be less effective than other forms of punishment, but criminogenic, as it completely neglects the psychosocial needs of prisoners and fails to rehabilitate them. Mass incarceration of black men is fueled by over-policing and targeting of black communities, and disproportionate charging, convicting, and sentencing. Mass incarceration destroys the economic prospects of former convicts, and has huge negative consequences on the children of those in prison. 1 in 9 black children have had a parent go to prison.
In general, black America thrived through individuals and decayed as a collective. Black people are incredibly overrepresented in pop culture and have gained worldwide fame. Black America has been vital to every element of American culture, however, especially so in music, where black people effectively created the genres of rap, rock, soul, gospel, jazz, funk, among others, even influencing mostly white genres like country. This is an immense credit to the black community and remarkably impressive. It's crazy to see wealthy suburban kids try to act like gangsters, and I just think, you know, those gangsters would be happy to switch lives with you. For example, I think the glorification of rap culture and the idea that education is seen as playing the white man's game in a lot of modern black culture is extremely counterproductive and unhealthy for the whole black society.
Whatifalthist claims that the glorification of rap culture is bad for the black community. But not long before this, he points out that rap music is also very popular among white Americans and internationally. How does he suppose that rap music is bad for black people but just fine for other ethnic groups? If it's not a unique variable to the black community, then how can it be explanatory for social problems? Not to mention that the crime rate has fallen since the emergence of the rap genre. So this argument is entirely based on aesthetics and his own dislike for rap music. So this is a stupid point, and not long before saying how successful rap music is, he claimed that black culture has failed as a collective. This entire narrative is a total mess.
But I don't think the current emphasis and direction that the black community gets preached at by social justice is healthy. You would never tell it to build its entire identity around victimhood and say that there's nothing it can do and try to get concessions from the rest of society. You would try to find a way to come to terms with the awful things that had happened and do what was right going forward. I have total sympathy for the black community, and trusting the rest of America after everything that's happened would be extremely difficult. However, I don't see why the modern wokes aren't just another brand of white elites who are trying to use black people for their own gain.
Whatifalthist says that there are people saying that the black community should base its entire identity on victimhood. For starters, who says this? This isn't a serious point at all. He then says that it should be difficult for black people to forgive white people for everything that's happened, which goes beyond any victimhood identity. There's no consistency or coherence here, and it fundamentally exposes Whatifalthist's ignorance of the lives and perspectives of black people. Whatifalthist also claims to have sympathy for the black community. But I don't think we should believe him. I don't know about you, but I don't repeat malicious lies about people I feel sympathy for, nor do I resurrect ancient myths. Whatifalthist also claims that we can't convince him that modern wokes are not simply white people trying to control black people. Aside from the fact that all the most influential voices on racial justice are black, Whatifalthist doesn't actually believe this, and I can prove it. In his other videos, he promotes moral foundations theory, which argues that liberals and conservatives are different psychologically, promoting the view that liberals are more focused on openness and fairness, whereas conservatives value purity and favor their own group, and that this is why liberals care about wider social issues. In fact, Whatifalthist calls the book this comes from, The Righteous Mind, a masterpiece. Except it's not a masterpiece. It basically ignores the social and economic interests behind ideology, and its authors have admitted that it's not really based on anything scientifically. Essentially, that it's just a fun way to frame things. So, in summary, in 1971, sociologist William Ryan wrote a book titled Blaming the Victim, discussing how the social and economic problems of the black community were blamed on cultural failings by commentators and academics. Whatifalthist is doing the same thing, except now he claims that there were no social problems in the 1960s, except that he is pointing to the same critiques of the black community that William Ryan refuted 50 years ago.
Number 4, Scottish Americans. Before we start, there are two main regions of Scotland that have cultures so different they basically boil down to different countries. The first is the flat English-speaking lowlands, and the second is the mountainous Gaelic-speaking highlands.
In any other video, this would be considered an embarrassing error, but in this one, it's a relatively minor one comparatively. There were historically, not are today, major cultural divisions between the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands.
Most Scottish Americans are lowlanders, and even people from the English side of the border who share a very similar culture. This area was overpopulated in the 18th century, and so many moved to Northern Ireland, becoming a majority there only to find more poverty and repression by English landlords. And then this group, which has become known as the Scots-Irish, immigrated to America in the middle of the 18th century.
This is wrong. The Scottish lowlands were not overpopulated during the 17th century, and the Ulster Scots, or Scots-Irish as they are known as in America, came to Ulster in the 1600s as independent migrants. and were more successful than their Anglican and Catholic neighbours, in part because of their independence, and because they claimed much of the best land. Then the explosion of the linen industry in the 1700s in Ulster brought improved living standards and prosperity. The Ulster Scots did migrate to America during economic downturns, but this was itself a consequence of their integration into the emerging Atlantic economy as mobile actors. Then the Scots-Irish economy in America and the economy of Ulster continued to develop in tandem. Scots-Irish merchants would send flaxseed and flour to Ulster, and ships would return with linen and indentured servants. Scots-Irish merchants were very prominent in New York, Pennsylvania, and Baltimore at the time of the American Revolution. As for repression, it is true that Ulster Presbyterians were politically disenfranchised by the Anglican elite of Ireland, but their frustration with this was itself a byproduct of their rising economic power.
They settled the Appalachian Mountains, or an area over 1,000 miles long from Pennsylvania to Georgia, and then migrated west, populating a giant part of the country extending out to New Mexico and Texas. The Scottish cultural influence in America is immense, whether through country music, cowboy, or redneck culture, combined with the classic stubbornness and freedom-loving that comes from fighting off the English for centuries. However, the Scots-Irish put very little emphasis on hard work and education, meaning the region suffers horrifying poverty. Drug use, fatherlessness, unemployment, and all the other bad statistics are at unimaginable levels in these communities. The book Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance is a very sobering look at this community from the inside. Most of the poorest states in the country are areas that are majority Scots-Irish ancestry.
So, Whatifalthist's caricature of Scottish and Scots-Irish Americans is also based on Albion Seed by David Hackett Fischer. And Fischer seeks to explain contemporary violence and poverty in Appalachia by explaining that Appalachians are stupid hillbillies, and so were their ancestors. It's not surprising that Whatifalthist likes this easy explanation, because it confirms his own biases. Cultural explanations always serve to soothe the consciences of middle-class Americans. But this is another classic case of blaming the victim. And it doesn't match the historical facts, and it is a completely unfair description of Appalachians and the Scots and Scots-Irish. First things first, Whatifalthist summarizes Appalachia and neighboring areas as being mostly ethnically Scots-Irish. This isn't true, and it isn't what Albion Seed argues either. Fischer starts with the assumption that Appalachia's uniqueness must come from its original cultural heritage. As with his other American regions, all regional identities must originate in the British Isles. But Fischer has seen estimates of the ethnic backgrounds of early Americans based on surname records, and the numbers don't add up to anything like a majority of Scots-Irish settlers across Appalachia. So he decides to lump them together in a cultural unit with Scottish Americans, which makes some sense, but this still isn't enough. So he estimates that 25% of the people with English surnames were from the north of England, and then lumps them all into a cultural group he calls Borderers, or North British. So besides the fact that no one has ever conceived the Scottish, Northern Irish, and Northern English as a single people separate from the rest of the UK, and the fact that Yorkshire is now included in 3 of Fischer's regions, this is fairly questionable, because evidence suggests few migrants from the north of England went to the Appalachian frontier during the colonial period, bursting this particular balloon. It is most useful for Fischer to lump all these people together, because although the Scots-Irish were the largest group of settlers within his North British category, he draws most of the stories of North British people being violent from the border region of northern England, which he then applies as a stereotype to the whole of his artificial category. He does the same with the Highland Scots, who he uses to describe a culture of wife-stealing, before shyly admitting that most Scots did not participate in this tradition. He connects Highland clan rivalries to the Appalachian Hatfield-McCoy feud, even though there is little evidence of feuding in Appalachia before the Hatfields and the McCoys. There is then the important fact that no scholar of Appalachia considers the Scots-Irish, or North Britons, to be a dominant cultural influence on the culture of the region, instead considering Appalachian culture to be both a fusion of many cultures and an offshoot of general Anglo-American culture that appeared after the American Civil War. So both Fischer and Whatifalthist insist that Appalachian poverty is related to the Scots or North Britons, but they ignore other regions heavily settled and influenced by those people, like Western Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Maryland, New Jersey, and of course Canada, which is a whole country. These examples completely contradict their narrative. Another interesting thing to note is that everywhere across Appalachia that I could find information, the Scots-Irish were significantly overrepresented among the economic and political elite, from western North Carolina to eastern Tennessee to western Pennsylvania, with more recent arrivals from Europe or other parts of the South being overrepresented among the poor. This was likely due to a combination of the Scots-Irish having had time to establish themselves and having strong social networks. This unsurprising fact again strongly challenges the narrative that Whatifalthist and David Hackett Fischer seek to paint. Whatifalthist claims the Scots-Irish put very little emphasis on hard work or education, and Fischer insists they were an oral culture who put little emphasis on formal education. Again, this narrative is contradicted by the facts, and again, Fischer's own statistics contradict him. Fischer's literacy statistics from lowland Scotland show that literacy was extremely high, although he then argues that literacy would have been lower among those who migrated to Ulster and then to America. In doing so, he ignores evidence from Ulster which shows that literacy was extremely high during the period. Fischer also ignores that the community leaders, the Presbyterian ministers, were all university educated, mainly at Glasgow University, at a time during the Scottish Enlightenment, when Scottish universities were the best in the world. As for their role in economics during early American history, just like the Scots-Irish dominated the linen trade, the Scots dominated the tobacco trade, which was the main export of colonial America. And this was obviously interconnected with the transatlantic slave trade. This also mirrored the influence of Scots throughout the British Empire. The idea that there was little cultural change from the Scots and Scots-Irish to modern Appalachia, promoted by Whatifalthist and David Hackett Fischer, is completely false. In fact, cultural evolution began immediately. Scots-Irish Americans embraced a common British-American identity, emphasizing a belief in British liberty. In turn, the Scots-Irish also majorly influenced early American identity, providing two of the main arguments for American independence: opposition to the English state church and Scottish common sense philosophy, which became the dominant school of thought in the new American Republic. The Ulster Scot philosopher Francis Hutcheson was the most respected moral philosopher of the American colonies, and Princeton University, founded by Scots and Scots-Irish Presbyterians, sent more of its graduates to the Constitutional Convention than any other university, including James Madison. Ian McBride calls the Scots-Irish the chief exporters of enlightenment to the colonies. Fischer has reluctantly acknowledged his mistake on this topic since writing Albion's Seed. Historians also agree that the most important part and cultural glue of the Scots-Irish was Presbyterian religion. But in Appalachia and much of the western frontier, Presbyterianism faltered. Poor congregations could not attract ministers, and instead converted to baptism or Methodism. This then facilitated intermarriage and intermingling with other ethnic groups, which helps explain why so many Appalachians identify their heritage as American, because they have mixed heritage going back to the 1700s. This leaves a conundrum. Why is, or perhaps was, Appalachia so much poorer than the rest of the country? Is it because of bad culture? Many before Fischer have suggested so, but what if we look at the history of Appalachia? So, Whatifalthist displays this graphic, which, as we've come to expect, is a terrible use of data. The reason the poverty rate is so high in most of these states is because it's so high among the black population. Obviously, I've discussed many of the reasons why poverty is much higher among black Americans. But if we look at these maps, we can see that poverty in Appalachia today is concentrated mainly in East Kentucky, with most of Appalachia in line with the rest of the South, which has changed dramatically since 1960. We can also see there has long been a stark divergence between northern Appalachia and southern Appalachia. This is not by accident or coincidence.
These areas did not differ in the culture of their original European settlers, but they did differ in history and institutions. Every part of southern Appalachia was tied to a slave state, where politics was dominated by elite plantation owners. These plantation owners saw urbanization, industrialization, taxation, and public education as threats to their interests, particularly the institution of slavery. Fischer acknowledges that the southern elite opposed public education, but he curiously doesn't appear to view this as consequential in the long term for these states. While northern states spent big on public education during the 1800s, southern states did not. This was much to the chagrin of the people of Appalachia, who repeatedly advocated for expansion of public education. The same goes for infrastructure. The construction of roads, canals, and railroads were crucial to economic development. Good roads could increase transportation speed by at least 4 times. Canal boats could carry 35 times the cargo of wagons, and railroads were both faster and could carry more freight than either. New York was made into a global city by the Erie Canal, which also facilitated the rapid development of the Northwest. Appalachians were constantly frustrated in their demands for better infrastructure. By the time of the Civil War, the South had 1/3 of the railroads and canals per land area the North had, and that was concentrated in the planter-dominated areas, with Appalachia getting little. During the period when Appalachia was settled by white Americans, land was sold to speculators in bulk, and because the land values did not increase as speculators wanted, in contrast to areas with better access to the market, they held on to the land, forcing tenants to hand over 1/3 of their harvest every year. When East Tennessee eventually did get the railroad it wanted, its positive economic impact was huge. Throughout the pre-Civil War period, poor families from the rest of the South continued to move in large numbers to Appalachia, as the expansion of large plantations forced them to migrate. The Civil War was a disaster for southern Appalachia. Although most of Appalachia opposed secession, most of the region was taken out of the Union to fight a war for plantation owners' interests. However, northern Appalachia stayed in the Union and enjoyed rapid economic growth, particularly in western Pennsylvania. The iron industry boomed due to high demand from war industries, and sheep farmers benefited from the lack of southern cotton competing with wool. They were also effectively subsidized by the high tariff policies that the Republican government implemented. Southern Appalachia was devastated economically during the war. Food and livestock were taken by both armies, and farmers were rarely compensated. Infrastructure was devastated, and the economy collapsed. After the war, southern Appalachia was way behind the rest of the country, particularly as the northern economy had kept growing. Northern and northwestern agriculture had adapted and improved as it was drawn into the market economy during the war in order to meet the high demands of northern armies. Southern Appalachia's integration into the market economy came as poor families sold their mineral rights to northern companies for cheap due to their extreme poverty. And of all the notorious tactics used by American companies during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were all amplified in Appalachia's coal and lumber industries. Workers had to live in company towns, paid in company coin, forced to buy goods at company stores, all to extract as much out of the workers as they could. Management sowed division by tactically importing workers, and efforts to form unions were sabotaged. During this period, wealth was effectively extracted from Appalachia to northern centers, all with the complicity of corrupt politicians. Vital reforms came with the New Deal and Great Society initiatives, particularly the Tennessee Valley Association and the Appalachian Regional Commission, and wages in the coal mining industry improved from the 1950s. Today, Appalachia is more in line with the rest of the country than it used to be. However, recently the coal mining industry has declined, facing fierce competition from cheaper above-ground coal mining in western states. This has caused a concentrated poverty in places like East Kentucky, whilst the legacy of hard manual labor in the coal mining and lumber industries
has contributed to the opioid epidemic in Appalachia, rather than it being a cultural failing, as Whatifalthist suggests. Many of the same structural problems in Appalachia remain. Education quality remains poor, and young people see better prospects in moving elsewhere.
Number 5. German Americans. Germans were popular immigrants among the local Americans since they were very hardworking and educated, normally more so than the local Anglo population, and kept their heads down, not starting fights or getting involved in local politics, as well as being incredible businessmen, becoming a major driver of the American economy. I mean, just look at companies like Steinway, Hershey, Chrysler, Studebaker, and Rockefeller, to name a few. The German Americans assimilated pretty easily into the Anglo society, with them already being industrious, white, Germanic Protestants.
It is a complete myth that Germans were more efficient or hardworking than other ethnic groups in American history. For example, studies have shown that German farmers were not more effective than their English and Scots-Irish counterparts in early American history. This is another case of Whatifalthist simply regurgitating old stereotypes rather than actual history. Whatifalthist then mentions John D. Rockefeller as an example of German-American hard work and industry, which is curious because Rockefeller had a diverse heritage and didn't even know that he had any German ancestry.
Number 6. Irish Americans. I'm half Irish, and so this is a cultural group I can speak from personal experience with. Most Irish Americans' ancestors came over in a 20-year period after the potato famine. Ireland had become incredibly overpopulated, with the Irish living on tiny plots of land, a couple acres, entirely dependent upon the potato. However, a potato blight came by in 1847, resulting in 1/3 of Ireland's population immigrating, 1/3 dying, and the rest staying.
Whatifalthist claims to be able to speak on Irish history because he is an Irish American, but then immediately proceeds to get things disastrously wrong. For starters, the Irish potato blight began in 1845. Not 1847. 1847 was the worst year of the famine. Whatifalthist then says 1/3 died and 1/3 emigrated during the famine. In the course of the famine, it's estimated that 1 million people died and 1 million people emigrated. Ireland's population was just over 8 million at the time. 1 million out of 8 million is 1/8, not 1/3. Really far off with that one.
Ireland was a brutal place. Most Irish were mired in horrifying poverty and hunger under an English domination that verged on a caste system. The English forbade the ethnic Irish from voting, owning land, or attending higher education in their own country, while almost all of the land was owned by English landlords that didn't even live in Ireland.
Whatifalthist is wrong about just about everything he says here. Rather than hunger being typical, the typical Irish diet before the famine was comparatively healthy, with plenty of nutrition. Irish society was not like a caste system. Catholics could vote, own land, and attend higher education by the time of the famine, although their political influence was limited by the power of the Anglo-Irish landlords, and incomes in Ireland were far below incomes in Britain or America for most of the century.
The Irish are probably the most stubborn people of all time, and built a massive sense of cultural unity around fighting the English, and would launch hopeless rebellions on a regular basis. Unlike Germany, which was an economic powerhouse, Ireland was a poor backwater, and so the Irish came to America with basically no education or tradable skills. They also came from a tribal warrior herding culture with little understanding of a work ethic or modern society. Even today, Irish Americans are the poorest large group of white Americans. The Irish had a strong sense of charisma and cultural identity, which meant they often gained political power. The Irish had no financial or business skill.
Whatifalthist correctly states that many Irish people were entirely dependent on the potato, and as immigrants they became unskilled labourers, but then says Irish immigrants during the famine were from a warrior herder culture. This is ridiculous. They were subsistence potato farmers, not herders, and certainly not warriors. But it gets weirder than this. The idea of Irish people being warrior herders actually comes from a discredited racial theory called the Celtic interpretation. Also, Irish people were comparatively well educated in contrast to other Europeans, although few had the qualifications needed for skilled industrial jobs, and were desperately poor when they arrived. Whatifalthist states that Irish Americans are the poorest large group of Americans. This is untrue. It's either French Americans or Portuguese Americans, depending on what counts as large. And in fact, virtually all European ethnic identities are very closely clumped together in average income. in spite of cultural differences, making basing this video on cultural determinism irrelevant, useless. It also brings to mind what I talked about earlier, about how much the US government was involved in elevating various white immigrant groups into the middle class through policies like the GI Bill.
Number 7. Italian Americans. The Italians lacked the aggression, unity, and charismatic culture of the Irish, but made up with it with work ethic and patience. Although the Italians have a reputation for being mobsters and criminals, that's only really the parasitic mafia elite, while the average Italian was incredibly law-abiding. However, their main weakness was their distrust of education and strong family collectives. If you're leaving an Irish family, your parents will ask you why the fuck you didn't leave earlier. If you're leaving an Italian family, your mother will burst into tears and ask why you're betraying the family.
Well, at least now, Whatifalthist is making up his own incorrect stereotypes, rather than the usual ones. Also, it's interesting how Whatifalthist separates the criminal element from Italian culture, something he was completely unwilling to do for Black Americans.
Number 8. Jewish Americans. The story of the Jews upwards from menial labor is pretty similar to that of the Irish and Italians before, but with one major difference, that the Jews had a much stronger emphasis on education. Inside the Jewish community, the social elite were the rabbis, or those who had studied the Torah best, and so Jewish culture had a tradition of education. The Jews generally kept their heads down and then sent their kids to the best schools. After World War II, the importance of education in American society went up tremendously, with the right colleges being the road to wealth, and the Jews thrived in that world. The Jews became one of the wealthiest groups in America, and the wealthiest large group of white Americans. At the same time, the Jews' lengthy history of being merchants back in Europe helped them a tremendous amount in America's capitalist society.
Whatifalthist gets the Jewish experience in Europe wrong, too. He obscures that for hundreds of years in Europe, Jews were barred from agriculture and many skilled trades. This left European Jews with no other choice but to become traders, many of them very poor street peddlers. But while economic necessity greatly encouraged literacy and skill at business, it was only then, when Jews came to America, where they faced less discrimination and no legal barriers, as well as a massively growing and dynamic commercial economy, that many Jewish immigrants were able to use their skills to thrive economically. It was not so much culture, although perhaps it played a role, but certainly the right skills in the right place at the right time that enabled so many Jews to prosper in America.
I think a really funny thing is that the leadership of both the right and the left now in America is heavily Jewish, and I think Jews are only 5% of America's population.
As for this picture, where he's claiming that Bernie Sanders and Ben Shapiro are the leaders of the American left and right, Bernie Sanders is a very prominent political figure, and Ben Shapiro is a well-known but hardly mainstream political commentator. Neither are the leaders of the American left or right.
Number 9. Asian Americans. However, like the Jews, they came from cultures that prized education. In many Confucian societies like Korea or China, the ruling classes were chosen by those who got the best test results. After World War II, when education became the road to wealth, the Asian community who had saved up money from their dry cleaners, restaurants, or gardening businesses sent their children to college to become CEOs, professors, or movie directors. Most Asian Americans came after the 1960s when the US opened up to non-white immigration and saw a massive flood of immigrants from Korea, China, Southeast Asia, and India. With the exception of wealthy immigrants who just immediately entered the American upper class, these immigrants normally followed a similar trajectory to the previous ones, of starting off as menial workers or minor peddlers, then putting their kids through college, having them enter the elite. Indians saw a similar trajectory, except that America pulled from the wealthier educated classes in India like doctors or coders, thus resulting in an easier transition into American society.
Whatifalthist correctly points out that Indian Americans tend to be from wealthy backgrounds. He then is incorrect in saying that East Asian immigrants are not. The purpose of this untruth is to use the success of East Asian immigrants as a tool to attack poorer minority groups, like Black and Hispanic Americans. This is typical of the conservative playbook. At the same time, he doesn't want to praise Indian culture, as American conservatives tend to have quite a low opinion of Indian culture, which is why he has made that exception. The truth is that immigrants from East Asian countries, in fact, Asian immigrants in general, tend to be what Jennifer Lee and Min Jo call hyper-selected, meaning they are more skilled and educated than either the typical citizen of their own country and the country they are migrating to, in this case America. For example, Chinese immigrants make up the largest number of East Asian immigrants, but whereas 4% of adults in China have a bachelor's degree, 51% of Chinese immigrants to America have a bachelor's degree, meaning that Chinese immigrants tend to come from a much more privileged socio-economic background than the typical Chinese citizen. Among recent immigrants, 52% have a degree, and this doesn't include those hundreds of thousands who are currently studying in America. Lee and Zhou observe that what Americans see as a common Asian immigrant culture are actually middle or upper middle class values and behaviors that are then reinforced as stereotypes. Whatifalthist was either lying or knowingly ignorant when he insisted that recent Asian immigrants have been poor menial laborers who started at the bottom rung of American society. Either way, it demonstrates what a fraud he is, who relies on easy narratives rather than actual facts in order to push an agenda. Ajimolu and Robinson observe that not long ago, when China was one of the poorest countries on earth, cultural determinists blamed Chinese culture. But now that China's economy has rapidly grown, they can't get enough of Chinese culture, even though that it was specific economic policies rather than cultural change that fueled that growth.
Number 10. Hispanic Americans. However, the immigrants provided cheap labor that undercut American wages, and so the American elite really didn't do much to stop it.
One thing I'll say about Whatifalthist's view of Hispanic Americans is that he blames Hispanic Americans for suppressing American wages. This is largely untrue. And in fact, like previous immigrant groups, they have been a massive boon to the American economy. If you've reached the end of this video, then I thank you for your patience. I realize that this video is very long, but I wanted to make sure that I did it right. But I think I've convincingly shown Whatifalthist to be substantially wrong on most of what he says in his video. If you'd like to see more content like this, then like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.